For nearly half a century, two names stood at the heart of the American Western: John Wayne and Randolph Scott. To millions, they were cut from the same cloth, men of courage, standing tall under the burning desert sun. But the truth was far more complicated. Behind the camera, the silence between them was heavy. It wasn't rivalry, it wasn't envy. It was contempt, deep, private, and unwavering. Randolph Scott, Hollywood's gentleman cowboy, loathed John Wayne. He didn't speak it often, but when he did, his words cut through decades of polite silence. "I respected his success," Scott once admitted, "but I never respected the man." For years, the reasons were lost behind closed doors, whispered in studios, buried in memoirs, erased by nostalgia. But the truth never fully vanished. It lingered in the quiet tone of Scott's interviews, in the contrast of their characters, in the unspoken war between authenticity and performance. Because in a world that worshipped loud heroes, Randolph Scott was the rare man who proved that silence could be stronger than noise. And that's what made his hatred for John Wayne so haunting and so revealing. Before he was a star, before he became the face of stoic heroism, Randolph Scott was simply George Randolph Scott, the second of 7 children born in 1898 to a proud Southern family. He grew up surrounded by traditions that valued character over wealth, modesty over fame, and faith over fortune. His father, George Grant Scott, was a respected textile executive. His mother, Lucille, was known for her poise and grace, the kind of woman who spoke softly but carried a moral gravity that filled every room. In that household, values weren't preached, they were practiced. The Scotts lived by rules that never made it into Hollywood. A man's word was his bond, his reputation sacred, and his pride something to be earned quietly. Randolph carried those lessons like a compass through life. He attended private schools, then studied engineering at Georgia Tech and the University of North Carolina. He wasn't searching for fame, he was preparing for a solid, honorable life, but history had other plans. When World War I erupted, Randolph enlisted. He served in France as an artillery officer, standing amid the chaos, watching what courage looked like when it wasn't dressed for the screen. The war carved something deep into him, a reverence for real bravery and a lifelong disdain for false heroism. When he returned home, he wasn't the same man. He'd seen too much to be impressed by vanity or noise. He carried a stillness within him, one that would later become the essence of his screen persona. In the early 1920s, during a visit to California, he stumbled upon Hollywood's growing empire. It was still raw and experimental, a world of dreamers, imposters, and showmen. But in that chaos, Scott saw something else, an opportunity to tell stories about men who lived by codes, not crowds. It was never about fame, it was about purpose. Randolph Scott didn't arrive in Hollywood with fanfare. He wasn't discovered in a cafe or pushed into fame by powerful friends. He built his path brick by brick, the hard way. He began as an extra, performing dangerous stunts for a few dollars a day, falling from horses, getting dragged through mud, taking punches that weren't always staged, all for a shot at a better role someday. He watched the industry from the sidelines and learned. While others chased fame, Scott studied patience. And when talking pictures arrived, that deep, calm Southern voice became his weapon. His early performances were deliberate and restrained. He didn't act to impress, he acted to be believed. His gaze was steady, his posture proud, his words measured. Audiences didn't just see a cowboy, they saw a man who understood silence better than most understood sound. By the 1930s and 40s, he was no longer a background figure. Films like Western Union, The Desperados, and Abilene Town turned him into the moral backbone of the Western genre. His characters weren't wild gunslingers or loud patriots. They were complex, men torn between duty and doubt, loyalty and loss. Scott brought conscience to the cowboy. And that's what set him apart. Where others sought applause, he sought truth. Where others built personas, he built legacies. He didn't drink to excess, didn't chase scandal, and didn't bow to studio politics. In an industry addicted to noise, Randolph Scott was the echo that lingered after the shouting stopped. That kind of integrity made him respected, and sometimes quietly resented, especially by men who couldn't stand silence. By the early 1950s, Randolph Scott had become more than an actor. He had become a symbol. His partnership with director Bud Boetticher turned the Western into something rare and thoughtful. In films like 7 Men from Now, Ride Lonesome, and Comanche Station, Scott's heroes were stripped bare. No grand speeches, no invincibility, just men trying to live by their principles in a world that no longer valued them. Audiences connected deeply with that stillness, because behind his calm eyes, there was always something unspoken. Sorrow, regret, faith, fear. He didn't need to tell you what he felt. You could see it in his silence. His westerns became meditations on morality. They weren't about the frontier, they were about the soul. Every sunset in his films felt like a metaphor for something fading, a kind of honor the modern world was leaving behind. Critics would later call him the philosopher of the West. But to Randolph, he was simply playing himself, a man who refused to bend when the world demanded compromise. It was that very quality, that quiet, stubborn authenticity, that drew a line between him and another cowboy who was becoming America's loudest myth, John Wayne. And to Randolph Scott, Wayne wasn't just different. He was dangerous, because he made America believe that swagger was the same as strength. While his on-screen life was filled with battles and dust, his real life was defined by peace. In 1936, he married Marion DuPont, heiress to one of America's most powerful families. Her lineage stretched back to the founders of the DuPont industrial empire. Her home, Montpelier, was once President James Madison's estate. For a brief moment, Randolph Scott found himself surrounded by the world of wealth, horses, and high society. But the fit was awkward, too stiff, too formal. He admired her intelligence and independence, but their lives were too far apart. He was the cowboy philosopher. She was the equestrian aristocrat. They divorced quietly in 19... No fights, no scandal, just two dignified people going their separate ways. But she never stopped using his name. For nearly 50 years after their separation, she remained Marion DuPont Scott. Perhaps out of respect. Perhaps because she knew there was something rare about the man she once called her husband. Years later, in 1944, Randolph met Patricia Stillman, a young actress whose beauty was matched by grace and humility. She was 20 years younger, but their hearts moved in rhythm. Together, they built a home that reflected everything he stood for: order, calm, and faith. They adopted 2 children, Sandra and Christopher, and raised them far from the noise of studio life. Their ranch near Santa Barbara became a sanctuary. Friends said it was one of the few places in Hollywood where peace wasn't just a word, it was a way of life. He loved horses, open skies, and the sound of wind moving through dry grass. It was in those moments of stillness that he felt most himself. The man behind the legend, far from the crowd, far from the applause. While many of his peers crumbled under fame, Randolph Scott quietly built a life worth living. And in that peace, he grew to despise the kind of man who mistook fame for purpose. John Wayne, the Duke, was everything Randolph Scott refused to be. Where Scott was quiet, Wayne was thunder. Where Scott believed in restraint, Wayne believed in spectacle. Wayne embodied America's self-image. Tall, brash, fearless. He filled screens with his booming voice and unshakable certainty. To the public, he wasn't acting. He was the West. But to Randolph Scott, it was all theater. He saw Wayne as a performer, a salesman dressed in cowboy boots. Wayne was a showman, Scott once said. I was a craftsman. And to him, that difference mattered more than fame. Behind the scenes, the 2 men barely tolerated each other. Their personalities couldn't have been more opposed. Scott was measured, polite, and spiritual. Wayne was loud, opinionated, and politically charged. Wayne often dominated conversations, turning every room into a stage. He talked endlessly about patriotism, the military, and American values. Scott, who had actually served in war, found those speeches empty. He once said quietly, "He liked to talk about war. I like to remember it." That difference between talking and understanding was the foundation of his hatred. The studios, eager for publicity, loved comparing them. To producers, they were 2 sides of the same Western coin. But to Scott, they were not equals. The studios tried to pit us against each other, he once said. But we were never playing the same game. Wayne's heroes were loud and untouchable, mythic. Scott's heroes were broken but honest. Wayne's West was black and white. Scott's was full of gray, and in that gray he found truth, while Wayne performed certainty. Hollywood insiders knew it well. If Wayne walked into a party, Scott would quietly leave. He never made a scene. He never spoke ill publicly. But everyone understood there was no friendship there. Wayne mocked Scott more than once, calling him too pretty to play a real cowboy. It wasn't said as a joke, it was meant to sting. Scott never forgot it. He thought being loud made him authentic, Scott said later. I thought being real meant being quiet. But it wasn't the insults that hurt him. It was the hypocrisy. Randolph Scott had served during the Great War. Wayne, despite his public image as America's great soldier and hero, had avoided service in World War II. While actors like James Stewart and Clark Gable wore uniforms and risked their lives, Wayne stayed home, making war movies about bravery he'd never lived. To Scott, that was unforgivable. I didn't judge the men who stayed home, he said, but I couldn't stomach those who pretended to fight wars on screen after refusing to serve in one. To him, Wayne's brand of patriotism wasn't courage, it was theater. A performance wrapped in flags and sound bites. Their feud wasn't a clash of egos, it was a clash of ethics. Scott represented the old America, the one that believed in quiet duty and humility. Wayne represented the new one, loud, proud, and always performing strength. Theirs was a silent war, fought not with words but with the distance between them. One man sought fame, the other sought truth. And only one walked away with his dignity intact. By the early 1960s, Randolph Scott had nothing left to prove. He ended his career on his own terms, with the film Ride the High Country, a story of aging lawmen facing a world that no longer valued their kind of honor. It was a fitting farewell. He played a man who wanted to do one last good thing before the end, a reflection of Scott himself. After that, he retired. No grand press tour, no desperate comeback, no late-life spectacle, just quiet. He had invested wisely, built a fortune through real estate, and spent his final years surrounded by his family and the open sky. He lived to be 89, passing away peacefully in 1987. Still married to Patricia, still dignified, still unbroken. She joined him 17 years later, buried by his side in Charlotte, North Carolina. Even in death, he remained the embodiment of what he'd always been, calm, proud, and authentic. Meanwhile, John Wayne's legend grew louder, but also more mythic, less human. He became an icon, but one wrapped in the very noise Scott had rejected. In the end, their legacies reflected their lives. Wayne shouted his way into history. Scott whispered his, and somehow that whisper still echoes longer. Because while the Duke performed courage, Randolph Scott lived it. Hollywood remembers John Wayne as the voice of America, bold, loud, and unbending. But those who looked closer always knew that somewhere behind that echo stood another man, quieter, steadier, truer. Randolph Scott's story isn't about rivalry or fame. It's about conviction, the rare kind that doesn't bend to popularity or myth. He taught the world that dignity isn't about the noise you make, but the peace you keep. That integrity doesn't fade when the cameras stop rolling. And maybe that's why his silence spoke louder than John Wayne's thunder ever could. Because sometimes, the greatest strength is not in drawing your gun, but in knowing when to walk away. If you believe Hollywood's truest heroes deserve to be remembered, subscribe and keep their stories alive.